everyone. My name is Ann Merchant, and I work for the National Academy of Sciences. And of course, I am joined by
Rick Lovard, Program Director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, a program of the National Academy of Sciences. And I just want to say, Ann, welcome back. It's been like hopping on one foot without you around the last couple of events. So thank you for coming back this week. We're excited.
Well, I'm very glad to be back. We'll see if we have our regular rhythm. And have we forgotten how to do this? I hope not. I hope not. But of course, our job is to just spend a minute or two or 3 minutes at the top before we move on to what you're all here for, which is, of course, to hear from our two featured speakers, Patricia Kuhl and Wendy Calhoun. But we do want to point you to a couple of things at the top of our event. The first of which is that the National Academies has done a lot of work on, because we have a board on social sciences and education at the academies. And they've done a lot of really fine work in the space of childhood education. And I think that Sachi's going to drop a link down there for you so that if you'd like to look at some of the work that the institution has done, it is all free to read on the Academy's website. So I encourage you to check that out. Some of the older work is still very relevant, and there's some really good information in there. And so, you know, a lot of what we do, it is pretty scholarly, it's pretty high level and academic. And of course, that's why we have programs like the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which makes our work more accessible and provides an opportunity for people to see it through a different lens. And that, of course, is the program that you run, Rick.
Yeah, so if you are a writer, producer, director, studio executive, novelist, storyteller of any kind, and you have a question about science, you can call us. Sachi's going to put a number down there, some contact info. Get in touch with us, and we will put you in touch with someone who knows what they're talking about. I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about, for free. If you are a STEM professional, it's your first time tuning in, and you're interested in volunteering and becoming part of this storytelling process, please absolutely be in touch. We're always looking for more people. I want to thank our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, without whose support we would not be doing any of our events. Also, we get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and lots of individuals. Many of you donated. Thank you so much, especially if you donated today. We really appreciate it. I want to thank Courtney, Sachi, Jeff, and Meche for all the technical background work that you do in actually making these events happen. Today, you are going to hear in a minute from a speaker who's going to sort of frame a conversation. And then that speaker will be joined by an eminent showrunner, Wendy Calhoun, who will go in conversation. If at any time during the event from here on forward, you have a question, you can enter it right here in the Q&A box, and I will be dutifully passing on questions to our moderator, Wendy. If we don't get to your question, I'm so sorry. It's my fault, not Wendy's, just for that. And if we get this question all the time, if you want the recorded version of this show after the show is over, you can go to our website. It should post by the end of the week. This week is a short week, so it might be a little different, but should by Friday, it's worth checking. And lastly, my rabbit hole, the thing that, as we were researching this event, really caught my attention. I found a Pew poll, it's a little old, it's about a year old, that said while 89% of people said COVID imposed negative changes on their life, no surprise. 73% said they could think of at least one positive thing that came out of this, this whole time period.
Yeah. And similarly, I also found an article, this one was in the Atlantic, that did point to some of the ways on which we can reflect in a positive light on the impact of the pandemic, this in particular on kids, that we've seen real evidence of resiliency and strength in the face of very difficult times. So it's always nice to be able to think of some of the good things that have come out of this. But I think that we're going to hear from Pat Kuhl, who I do want to mention. There are lots of things in her bio that we saw in this week's invitation that tell you about how accomplished she is. But of course, the thing that I always want to brag on is the fact that we do have a member of the National Academy of Sciences on our virtual stage. And Pat is also a member of the Council of the National Academy of Sciences. And it was when members of the council give what's called a council talk. And I happened to be sitting in the room when she gave her council talk. And a lot of that council talk is on their life's work and how they came to their life's work. But I was also just incredibly fascinated by the work that she does. And I was spellbound when she was talking about her science and her research. And of course, I'm always kind of talent scouting. So it was at that moment that it was like, okay, we have to get Pat on our stage so that she can talk about the research that she does. And in particular, she's been doing some fascinating work into the impact on children and their brain development during this extraordinary last 2 years. So we felt especially gratified when we sent an invitation out and asked if she would join us and give us the benefit of what she has learned over the last couple of years. So Pat, we would love it if you would join us, and we'll hand our stage over to you and let you take it from here. So again, thank you for being here, and we'll go away, but we're going to be listening. So thank you.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to join everybody today. Thank you all for joining. Today, I want to share some information. I'm going to share my screen that comes from the world of science, and we're going to be talking about how the COVID-19 has affected our kids. And of course, what we want to learn is what is it that makes the pandemic be so impactful on our social brains. Yes, we have a social brain. And here I depict two people looking at each other and imagining what's going on in their brain. We don't have to imagine much longer because we're actually beginning to do face-to-face neuroscience with two machines that allow us to look at two brains while two people are socially interacting. There's actually evidence to show that when two people are in a pleasant, positive conversation, that their brains, their neurons fire at the same rate. So there's a sense in which our social brains, which evolved a long time ago, allowed us to survive because we could cooperate and collaborate. So it isn't as though there's one place in the brain that is the social brain, but parts of the brain dedicated to reading faces, to watching eye movements, to following facial expressions, shoulders, and every other body posture that tells you what's the attitude of the person that you're interacting with. We use our social brains to predict what a person really means and what they're going to do next. And we also use our social brains to learn, particularly in early childhood. When you think about it, most everything with regard to culture, our attitudes, our beliefs, our values, our habits, even language, is produced through social interaction. We watch, observe, and copy what others do. And it turns out that these social skills come online really early in development. Here's an experiment in which a female researcher faces a child at 1 year of age sitting on her mom's lap. And the experiment has the adult turning either right or left to look at the same kind of object. But the test is whether or not the child will follow the adult's gaze. By 1 year of age, children will implicitly follow without instruction. If an adult turns to one side or the other, will follow their gaze, with the understanding that what we look at is interesting. And so we follow one another's gaze all the time to find out what the other person is thinking about. So this timing about social skills coming on board in the beginning of life, at the end of the first year, is extremely important to language learning. Timing is everything. And the sensitive period for learning language is in that first 7 years of life. And in fact, in the first year of life, babies are mastering the sounds that are used to create words in a particular language. So we've been doing experiments on babies who are very, very young to look at the impact of social interaction on learning language early in development. We ran experiments in which we introduced a new language to a baby at 9 months of age, trying to see whether or not babies in groups, such as you see here, with a speaker of a foreign language, this person spoke Mandarin. We have other experiments with other languages. And the idea is, if during this critical time for learning, between 9 and 10 months when they're mastering the sounds, if they're exposed socially as opposed to exposed via screens, how will they learn? So let's look at the social case.
Jasper, 早安 Finn. 嗨，我们要来讲一个故事哦。今天要讲的故事是《小熊七七探险记》。来看看发生了什么事情哦。小熊七七在这里，一个绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，转一下，转一圈，嘿，一圈，再一次哦，转一二三。
Okay, so what we found is that babies are riveted by this social experience. And in fact, their brain and behavioral responses, after only 12 sessions between 9 and 10 and a half months of age, they became so good at hearing the words and sounds of Chinese that they were just as good as the kids growing up in Beijing or in Taiwan at that time, in Taipei. So it didn't take much, the right information at the right time. Babies' social skills allowed them to learn. We knew that the effects of social interaction were profound because when you ran the exact same experiment in the same room, same dosage, same sessions, but babies were now learning from a beautiful DVD screen, no learning occurred. Even though infants crawled up to the screen, looked at the screen, touched the screen, their brains and their behavior following this experience showed that they had learned nothing. They were exactly like the control group who'd been exposed just to English. Their Mandarin skills did not improve at all. So there's something about the social brain that allows this kind of learning to occur early in development. When we then went on to do brain studies using a $2.5 million machine to allow us to put babies safely, non-invasively in a machine that reads their brain activation while they're experiencing various kinds of stimulation, what we've seen is that when the baby is listening or looking at something produced by a human, as opposed to something not produced by a human, but equally complex, the brain shows very different responses. So here's an example of the brain of a 12-monther when we're looking at responses to a word or something that is produced by a human, as opposed to something that is not produced by a human, but equally complex. We're looking at auditory regions and Broca's area, which is the area you use to plan to talk back. If you're planning to talk back as you listen to me, your Broca area is activated. And here we see, this is the experiment showing brain activation as these red bubbles in a 12-monther. And it wasn't only the auditory area, but the motor areas that will allow the baby to talk back. So our brains are so social that as we simply listen, we're getting ready to participate in the social conversation. And our most recent data shows that this link between perception and action is there in the brain of a 2-monther. Maggie Clark, my PhD student, has just done an experiment before COVID. She analyzed it during COVID to understand that this seems to be there very, very early in development. So we have these very social brains that give us information. There's also evidence that social stimulation give us a kind of squirt of dopamine in our reward areas of the brain. Our brains register reward when we are hungry and we eat, when we're thirsty and we drink, for all manner of things that we like to do. And we can see in this experiment by Stavropoulos at UC Riverside that when you use faces or arrows in a game in which we're using these stimuli as feedback, typically developing kids show this dopamine reward response to faces and not to arrows, whereas children with autism, these are kids between 7 and 15, the children with autism don't respond to faces, they respond more to the arrows. So we have this social brain that's rewarded in the settings in which we are face-to-face with one another, and it gives us tons of information. So the schools and educational systems that are most successful rely on these social brains and what we know about the social interaction and its power. When kids are in classrooms and they're interacting, they're with each other, the mere presence of other kids seems to support learning, our studies are showing, but the interaction in small groups, in larger groups where you can see one another one-on-one and together, classrooms are more successful when they allow kids to interact, to learn together, to read the social behaviors of others and use that to support learning. So that's the backdrop up to 2018 of what our classrooms look like. And then the pandemic hits in March of 2020. 2020, March, changed everything for all of us. It reduced our worlds. We went to our homes. Our social worlds were cut off. We were in a totally different routine. And if you read the New York Times this past Sunday, they had a very interesting article on the world of Zoom where babies join the chat. The effect on parents and infants was profound, especially for people who were working and trying to do that on Zoom while taking care of kids. And while there were good pieces, there were some very good reports of parents, especially fathers, saying that they got to know their children in totally different ways, that the activities that they engaged in were enriching their lives, and they felt wonderful about the fact that this pandemic had the good side of allowing them to share more of their children's lives. On the other hand, the frustration was clear that trying to work, take care of kids, and to operate in a way that restricts you to your own house makes it very difficult. And of course, the children went to school via Zoom. And of course, this was not an equitable situation because learning on Zoom, learning over a screen requires not only the equipment, which is expensive and many families did not have access to, but internet access that was reliable. And many of us have seen messages on Zoom when your internet is not reliable. So it was not equitable from that standpoint, and it was not equitable from the standpoint that kids with disabilities, those with hearing impairments, with vision impairments, speech, language impairments, difficulty understanding, motor impairments, so they couldn't respond by doing things that they were asked to do, they were left more behind than the kids who could at least attempt to access school remotely. But as the pandemic wore on, and particularly after schools stopped, then started, and then stopped again, reports started coming in that the kids were exhausted. They couldn't follow, they weren't learning. Parents were saying they've just given up. They're not doing it anymore. They're not paying attention anymore. They can't, they need help. So I've been very interested in the effect of COVID-19 on kids' learning. Given my emphasis on the social brain, I thought that there would be a loss. So I was looking to educators who have been studying. They've formalized a way to measure learning loss because many of our educators know that even summer, the 3-month summer, does produce a learning loss from spring to fall. And so this is just a graphic showing how the measurements that I'm going to show you next are being calculated. So the typical learning is coming from all that we know about how much a child typically learns in first grade or third grade or fifth grade. They've got days, years worth of data. And then learning that occurred. What does learning look like during COVID? What does it look like in 2021 as compared to 2018, for example? And the difference between those two is defined as a learning loss. So let's look at some of the data and what we're seeing. So on this graph, we're looking at reading scores, standardized measures, excellent research methods being used here for grade 3, grade 5, and grade 7-year-olds. Fall, winter, and spring are displayed across the graph. And the dotted line is 2018 to 19, the last normal year we had. And the closed line, solid line, is 20 to 21. And you can see that in the fall of 2020, we were still okay, but as you got to winter and then to spring, you can see measurable statistically significant losses, and particularly in the younger grades. The math scores are worse. That third graders, fifth graders, and seventh graders across that same time period in the same schools had greater losses in their math scores. If you look at this in terms of a loss and percentile rank between 2019 and 2021, here the open circle is where kids were at spring 2019 measurement points, and then the percentile loss when you measure again 2 years later in the spring of 21. And when you can again see that the loss in math is bigger than the loss in reading. And then you can look at the differences across grades from 3rd to 8th grade on both reading and math. And you can see that it's pretty uniform for reading and math, that there is a measurable loss that's fairly consistent with the worst losses occurring for the younger kids. Here's the most discouraging piece that I need to share with you, and that is when you look at learning loss by race and ethnicity in reading and math, you can see it's extremely clear that people of color have lost a lot more. So look at reading at the top, math at the bottom. Starting at the left, we're looking at Asian American, then white, then Latinx, then Black, then American Indian, and I can't see that label, American Indian and Alaskan Native. And so you can see, again, the dots and the loss in percentile rank, and they have been substantial, but more for Latinx, for Black and American Indian and people of color. In math, the score losses are even worse, but again, that same pattern is seen. I think there's two things interesting about this graph. First, if you look at just the open circles, you can see that kids didn't start out in the same place. Our schools have not solved the problem of equity across our race and ethnic populations. Schools are doing a poor job of educating Latinx, Black, and American Indian, Alaskan Native students than it is Asian American and whites. And that's true for both reading and math. So it's not only that they started out worse, it's that the loss is greater. And then we can also look at percentile rank by school poverty. And here again, you see that low poverty schools are losing less than high poverty schools. The effects there are very, very dramatic. Okay, then moving to children's mental health. It isn't only their academic performance that we're interested in. We know from our own families and our friends and ourselves that the pandemic has introduced novel stressors in our lives. We worry about our health. We worry about our social relationships and losing them. We haven't seen our families. We haven't seen our friends. Parents worry about the financial situation, and that worry carries to their children. The kids are worried about school and about advancing, about following the trajectory that they imagined themselves happening. And our physical environments have become harder because we're all in one space. We're not used to working all on top of each other in the same house all the time. So a variety of studies appearing in 2020 and 2021 are documenting increased anxiety and depression, particularly in preteens and teens. And these studies can be looked at more carefully for the kinds of things that they're measuring, but the results are fairly convincing that anxiety and depression has definitely gone up. And I think perhaps more importantly are the studies that show what are the protective factors, what are the things that predict that children are going to be resilient in spite of what's going on during COVID. And here in a study to 7 to 15-year-olds, the protectives turned out to be having a structured routine, keeping things as constant as possible helped. Having less passive screen time. So Zoom is considered active, interactive screen time, but simply viewing, doom scrolling or simply viewing passive media is not a good protective factor. Doing less of it is protective. Getting adequate sleep, and I think interestingly, spending more time out in nature. Kids who had a chance to go outside, to play, to walk, to just be in nature turned out to be more resilient. And then I want to end with an example of, as we all know, necessity is the mother of invention. And what's happened during COVID, as researchers found that they couldn't do their interventions to improve learning in person anymore, researchers turned to inventing really clever and interesting and successful online educational interventions. Here's one from a postdoc of mine, Yale Weiss-Zura, and she decided to pivot right to an online reading camp for 2 weeks. 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds joined a 3-hour-a-day Zoom class that was fun and filled with learning and games. And it turned out to be quite social, that the kids who got their boxes in the mail, you can see that pictured on the left, filled with all kinds of things that they would be using during the camp. And then you see a picture on the right of one of the screens that the kids were shown. And then all of the kids with the two teachers in their ridiculous chicken hats that the kids loved, and holding up their eggs to indicate that the item that they see, the horse, begins with the letter H. And so they're holding up their blue eggs. And what you saw in these Zoom sessions that I've viewed countless of is that the kids got to know each other, and they would chat with each other. They would help each other. Hold up your blue egg, Sammy, it's blue. It's the blue one. It's H for horse. You know, they became social. They wanted to get on Zoom outside of this reading camp and play with each other on Zoom and talk to each other. So partly, I think we can create new ways of operating if we have to learn remotely that can, you know, link up to our social brains. And you see in the middle, the phonological awareness scores after a 2-week camp, 2 weeks at 5 years of age, taught children to read. And I think that's phenomenal. Here's my last slide. In 2009, colleagues of mine at the University of Washington, at Stanford University, wrote a paper for Science in which we were saying, when you really look at the interdisciplinary knowledge we're sharing now from neuroscience, psychology, machine learning, and education, the social piece is extremely important. And we were saying that schools, the science is pointing to the importance of social interaction. Schools that use social interaction are more successful. It's time to build a new science of learning and understand how the social brain can improve learning for all. Now, looking back with the pandemic, not quite, but almost in the rearview mirror, knock on wood, we hope, that seems like a very prescient message. And I think what we have to do is understand that adversity of all kinds brings out the best in us sometimes. And I believe that we will see creative new ways of teaching online and learning online. I also think that when the kids get back to school, when they really get back to school, when we go back to our offices and to our universities and our corporations, that there will be an exuberance, there could be an exuberance, an appreciation for being together again, to understanding what one can lose without the ability to interact, to collaborate, and to share our stories and our knowledge, and that will produce a phenomenal, exuberant growth in learning and development, not only for us, but all of our kids. Thanks, everybody. And Wendy, I can't wait to hear you join in here and what your reactions are to all of this stuff.
Well, I have reactions.
I know you were. I know you were.
First of all, you know, I'm here representing the entertainment tribe, if you will, all of us writers, producers, directors, creative people. I'm really happy you left us on a good note there, that you were expecting a renaissance. So I'm hopeful we'll all be part of that. I do have some specific questions to your slides, though, that I've got to ask.
Sure.
I mean, I was really blown away by what was happening with learning when you were comparing reading and math.
Yeah.
And the idea that you have something that I think of as more social, which is reading, still outperforming the losses in math, which I don't think of as social. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's possible that both of these have to be taught. Okay, so whereas social language, speaking, listening, that's automatically going to happen if you're in an environment. In order to learn to read, in order to do math, you have to be taught explicitly. So I'm imagining that the teaching of math is more complicated. It takes longer in our school years to really attain math, that it's a set of operations and algorithms that are non-intuitive, except to the math oriented. And I think that the hit is bigger because it requires more hands-on instruction and piecemeal instruction. That's a guess. Math teachers would certainly weigh in here and have very interesting things to say. Reading is that critical moment at age 5 where you break the code. I watched kids in this 2-week camp break the reading code by getting the idea, oh, you mean those black lines on that white page? Those stand for words. the words that I already know. They're referring to objects in the world. It was like an aha, eureka. There is a kind of skill, a sort of ramping up to this understanding, and then this skill that once you have it, yes, you don't have it in its full-blown complexity, but it's like this one big moment of breakthrough when you understand what it means to read. I think math is different. It's more piecemeal. It has a bigger scaffolding that's required.
Right, right. And I think back to my own daughter's early childhood days. I mean, there was so much reading that was going on between the child and me directly.
Right. Yeah.
And
whereas you're not playing math games as much. You know, in Singapore and in India, it's interesting. Asian countries and India, they play a lot more math games, and the kids are better at math. So, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, we read to our kids a lot. And so reading, once they get that, they want to break that code. They're very eager to read. I think they want to understand math, but it's not part of their world, not as much as it is for the kids in countries in which math becomes a piece of their play. So that's interesting.
In your school research, were you including private schools as well, or was it mostly a public school group? What was the?
So these aren't my research studies. This is what I've culled from the literature, and they're very broad. These are sort of national groups, nonprofits that study assessments and gather data from schools across the nation. And so they had a set of rules. They were looking, it was very difficult during COVID, you know, the assessments were there in 2018 to 19, but then to get the data in 20 and 21 was harder. But in the papers that are cited, you can find the details about what schools they were able to get to, but their idea was to get to every single school that they could, wide open. So across all socioeconomic status, cities, parts of the country. Yeah, they're trying to build a repertoire of data that will allow us to really understand what happened. And what is surprising me is how uniform the findings are. It's not just this group, this NWEA, that has demonstrated this finding that math is suffering more than reading, but every group that's producing this kind of data seems to show that, and that the younger kids are hit more, presumably because they require the instruction. They're being robbed when school is out of session.
Do you have theories on the discrepancy that's going on for students of color?
I think students of color are not faring as well in school. Think about it before the pandemic. I was very struck by the data showing that, you just look at the open circles, they were so much poorer off before the pandemic, and then they lost more during the pandemic. Our schools are not addressing children of color to the degree that they need to. Now, why is that? Is it because our materials and our way of behaving and our lesson plans, everything is pointed to the main, the privileged group in society? Are the lessons we learn from, are the stories we read, are the math examples we give all less involving people of color and families and their, stories? Are we sort of missing their social piece more than white kids? I don't know. I also think that poverty, and you saw the last slide that just contrasted regardless of race. Just look at poor neighborhoods versus wealthier neighborhoods and their schools, and the loss is profound in less wealthy neighborhoods. And that means that what's happening in the schools, the equipment, everything that schools have are probably less, less rich in the materials that they have, the activities that they allow, the visits that the kids get to do, the computers they have access to, everything across the board in the schools and potentially in the homes. Now homes either are loaded with technology where kids, we used to have need for an encyclopedia. When I grew up, if you were rich enough to have an encyclopedia, right? It felt like you had access to everything. But these days, and maybe it's a bit too much, kids who are just relying on technology constantly and are not in social groups. I'm not in favor of that. But the world of information now is coming through things that cost a lot of money. And so access to technology and also talking about what you learn, just the conversations differ. And that reinforcement of what you're learning and kids' ability to reframe what they're learning in their own words, all of that is shown in brain studies to reinforce learning and memory.
Did you do any studies or read about any studies with babies of color? And were there any interesting findings there, or, you know?
There's not much yet on the babies, because there is this positive piece that I mentioned that parents were saying in the beginning of the pandemic, oh my gosh, it's lovely. I'm home during the first word. I'm here to watch tying shoes. I'm here to go out to the backyard and play with the dog and play baseball and I do whatever we do. I'm watching and sharing in my child's life. But that, as it wore on, this idea that the stressors, so the stressors that parents feel are communicated to children. Our social brains are so good. Parents don't get by with being depressed on the side. They don't. If they're depressed, if they're sad, if they're worried about money, they're worried about their futures, they're worried about their kids, all of that is carried to the children because their faces and their bodies and their attitudes just reek of that sadness. And kids are just, we are all masters at picking that up. And so what I think is that there's a two-sided story here, a tale of two cities in a sense. There was this immediacy of being with your children, which was a gift. And then there was this, as it wore on and as our nerves wore down, you know, the COVID fatigue, this sense of being isolated, I think that it took a toll. And even in my neighborhood, I knew the kids, talking to them about what they were going through, the loss of their friends. A neighborhood boy who mentioned that not being able to play sports, that was the last straw. There was no school, but at least he could get out there with his buddies and play, do something with the other guys. And when that left, you could hear them, while they might not say the word depressed or anxious, they would reflect it as they told you what they worried about and how they were feeling. So I don't think we know as much about the babies and the outcomes. The parents, none of us know. We've run this experiment that we didn't want to run. And we're going to run another experiment as we join back into the world. And I guess the science and our own ability to reflect and write will tell us a lot about what we've just been through.
Right. Okay. To that end, let's say I want to write my next script and I want to set it in 2022. We'll start it in July 2022. And I'm easing my children out of the cocoon of this pandemic. Right. What are some of the first things that I could be doing? What would the first scenes be like of me trying to, I don't know, get their social brains reconnected?
I think one of the first things that you can do is talk to them about it ahead of time, because they're going to feel a little reluctant, just as we do when you walk. You know, you've been used to crossing the street when you see someone coming, because in the beginning we didn't even know that you had to be 6 feet was enough, you know, that kind of thing. We've gotten a little shy about interacting with other people. Some of us will never go to a football game again. We will never go to a concert. You're afraid of that massive number of people. I think the kids, while they may not be able to articulate it, will be a little anxious about going back. We've taught them to put these things on their faces, as uncomfortable as they are. And now we told them, you must wear this to be safe. There are germs out there. Other people have the germs, cover your face. Now we're going to say, take them off, you're fine. I think they will be anxious. And so I think talking about it at home, saying, what do you think it's going to feel like? Do you think it will feel good? You know, it will probably feel good, right? But also maybe you're feeling a little anxious about it, a little worried about it, and probe that. I think probing it, letting kids talk about what they're feeling, you'll be amazed what you'll hear.
Wow. Okay. I believe you. I'm curious too about, there were two kind of things that you introduced in your slides. One was that this idea of the passive video, right? And that I guess that social brain isn't learning as much from that passive video experience.
Right.
But then you had this sort of hybrid, I would say, like the interactiveness of the box of toys that comes, that you suddenly are interacting with that screen. I just love to talk a little bit more about the differences there, because
well, we're going to have to do some neuroscience on those things, because, it was a little bit more black and white before we could see that you can induce what sure looks like social pleasure among these little 5-year-olds, saying, Sally, hold up the blue one, and wanting to be with each other even if it's on a screen. So I think it could be, we were right about to start it before the pandemic. We're starting this face-to-face neuroscience work with mothers and children, where both of the people who are face-to-face in a booth, they're both wearing brain devices. They're both, the baby's in the little Meg machine, that $2.5 million machine, and mom is going to be in a brand new wearable. It's actually a first in the world wearable. You wear this helmet. It's like really sci-fi. And both brains are being monitored while they interact with one another pleasantly, socially. And then mom, as we often do as mothers, turns away to do something else and completely ignores the baby. We started out these experiments having her punch a cell phone, and the babies got so upset they would cry, and we had to stop. But when she turns and talks to someone else, it's a little less unpleasant, but we see what happens in their brains when they're doing this. And so when you're face to face in a pleasant conversation, you really are firing on the same cylinder. You're firing at a neural rate that's constant. And when you break that chain of social, then you break that neural firing. What new experiments we're going to have to design is what happens when you're doing FaceTime, when you're doing, you're talking to relatives over, Zoom or some comparable. If you know that person and you're remembering things you've done together, when you're tying that social knot again, does that activate those brain centers? I mean, so our social brains, when we get into social settings with people, we immediately want to respond. Like if you're listening, your brain's getting ready to talk, and it's like formulating in the motor areas. It's doing that at 2 months, we've recently learned. And so we'll have to see, what does it take to turn that on?
Right. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You're reminding me of something very close. But when the pandemic first hit, right, what did we do? Okay, in this house, we watched Tiger King. And my teenage daughter really loves her TikTok. And so she taught me the Carol Baskin dance. And we would watch the dance, and then we would do it together. And actually, throughout this entire pandemic, one of the things she's been doing on the occasion that she is able to see a friend is some sort of interaction of at least learning dances online and doing it with her friends and them making videos of it. And so I don't know, I'm curious, do you see that hybridization coming more and more on all levels, babies, teenagers?
Yeah, all of us. I think there's something special about mirroring one another. I think dancing together, being in movement together, talking to conversational turns back and forth boosts the brain early in development. And this kind of dance, it's ancient. Think of how cultures unified one another in our ancient, early hominids would dance around the fire. They'd move around the fire. So this movement together, doing things in synchrony, whether that's turn taking in conversation or dancing or doing a kind of reciprocal action. Even when we're playing, when you roll a ball to a baby and the baby rolls it back, there's a kind of constancy in that movement pattern that I think brains pick up on. It's partly how we know we're human. If you were trying to tell the difference between a Martian, E.T., remember the movie E.T., where you finally, the convincing point, Spielberg shows this E.T. is trying to mouth words and pointing home and doing things that were absolutely exclusively human. And it conveyed the point because those actions were the same. That entity has to have something in common with being human. And so this idea of imitation, that's how culture is transmitted. This kind of the way we copy actions and patterns and beliefs and speech to be a part of a group, to be belonging to a group. And, just again, we celebrate the social brain. I celebrate it all the time. There's a downside, and that is we depend so much on being parts of groups that in school, bullying is a really serious problem, that when a child feels isolated from a group, it leads to very serious, consequences for that child, depression and anxiety, sometimes suicide in the most extreme cases. But that is, again, the downside of the importance of our social brains. We need each other. We have this need to feel a part of a group. I belong to something. I'm not just in isolation. It's not just me against the world. It's I belong to a group.
Mm-hmm. Two things. I mean, that the first thing you're talking about, ET, those mirroring moments that you kind of mentioned, that's actually a negotiation tactic, but it also, those are the moments where I felt, as a writer, we're always looking for those moments where you feel some sort of emotion. Yeah. And there was a connection that I felt when those moments were happening. It's pretty interesting. And then, you were talking about bullying. What are some of the negative things that happen in these social interactions? And it brings me back to something I think we've discussed, which is there's a large group of parents of color who have no desire to send their children back to a classroom.
Right, because they didn't feel they belonged. Their children are not being celebrated. Their children don't feel as though they're belonging. Their children are feeling, when they go to school, they join the social group and they still feel isolated. And so, yes, I've talked to parents who say, no, the way schools are operating for me, for my family, for my child, I'd rather keep them at home. And so homeschooling, the popularity of homeschooling has increased. And I think to a certain point, parents are capable of teaching their children at home, but they have to be really careful about the social piece. Kids need their peers. They really do. We're great, social partners with our children, but you just have to see 2 5-year-old boys playing, 8-year-old girls, even toddlers crawling towards each other at a party on the floor to get near each other. They have a strong affinity to each other, and it takes one that's like them, about the same size, about the same age. They need partners. And so, yes, kids, if they cannot find that in school, I think parents should try to seek a school in which their child's social needs are met, where they feel they belong, where they're part of a group. And I can understand the drive of some parents to teach them at home, but there's a downside there too, because supplying a child with the social world is harder, and then they'll have to join a social world. And so, they have to be prepared to join a social world.
Wow. Well, we have so many questions for you from people that are watching. I want to make sure we get to some of them. This is a question from Harriet. She says, how quickly does the learning loss recover? I see my grandsons. It took them a few weeks to move up in social relationships to closer to their age.
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. We don't have enough data yet. I am hopeful. I mean, you look at the summer recovery, but that's different. The summer kids are playing, they're happy. They've been 3 months away from their friends. They have a loss when they come back to school, but they quickly catch up. This has been very long. This has been very hard. This has been much more stressful. I still, however, having studied the brain, so resilient, so reliant on, communicating with others and growing with others, that I think that we will see this spring back. How long will it take? I don't know, but it will spring back. And I think there could be, if you look at the learning curve, you could see it actually accelerate. You could see it go faster when they get back, because they will newly appreciate what it means to be in school with one another and kind of exuberantly embrace that, as you called it, a renaissance. In a way, I'm kind of dreaming of a renaissance where they come back in, they're really happy, they're excited to learn together, and that it will go fast and then level off. But they will catch up. They will catch up. I don't think of this in any way as an inexorable loss. It's something we have to pay attention to, but And we need good social schools to make it work optimally. But I do feel that they're going to come back.
Yes, I still believe in the roaring 20s. We're good
Yes,
there.
well, so did I. Fashion and everything else. The roaring after the Depression, there was this growth. This was acceleration in everything that we did in business, in art, in fashion. It was like a realization that we're, run with it. The ball is here in your hands, run with it. And I think we might see something like that, new inventions and exuberant of in spirit, which kind of just increases innovation, increases experimentation, and it could be a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, we have a question from Peter. This is interesting. I like this one. So author Zaretta Hammond says, first, we have to stop saying that students lost something. Then we have to figure out what they did learn and use that as part of the scheme or the schema that allows us to make connections. Your
All right. Great point. Great point. I mean, calling it lost doesn't do anyone any good. And it is a kind of negative connotation. And so, yes, I think as scientists, we've got to look at the data and embrace it, understand what it means. But I think the sooner we turn to what did we miss? Like, what did you miss about your daily lives? How do you want to embrace that when it comes back into your life? What would you like to achieve? What can we learn from what's happened? Turn it to a positive. Allow kids to understand and pat themselves on the back for surviving. All of us should pat ourselves on the back for surviving. This has been hard. It continues to be hard. We're not out of it yet, but we should understand what it's taken in terms of character, fortitude, grit, whatever you want to call it. It's taken something to survive, and we should spring from that. So I like that comment a lot.
Yeah. Latoya has a question. She says, what about neuroplasty for language for children that did not have the opportunity to socialize as much in the pandemic? Is there hope for those children to learn language now?
Oh, yes. No, I think that, there are these notions of optimal times in development, critical windows, critical opportunities, right? Critical periods, sensitive periods. That I'm a believer in that. My research supports that. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that you stop learning the second you're out of that time window. No way. Brains remain plastic your whole life. There are optimal periods, but it doesn't mean if something wasn't there at that time that you can't, re-engage with that issue and problem. You want to optimize learning. You want to strengthen all of the things we know about how to learn best. When it comes to languages, learning socially, putting yourself in that social setting. Most of the classrooms in the United States teach languages at the wrong time, not when we're young and our brains are supple and plastic, but in high school, when their brains are at the bottom of that curve, when that period of plasticity is winding down. And we teach them not socially, but we teach them with declensions on the, blackboards or on the screens. That's not the way to learn. If we were social in our exchanges, if you put teenagers in a classroom in which they had to navigate by using that second language, navigate a game, a playful activity, using French instead of English or Mandarin or any other language, and it was social, they were driven to communicate socially, believe me, they would learn. Yeah.
That's a good point. I'm thinking of all the immersion programs that are around elementary schools and how quickly languages are learned in those situations.
Exactly. No, they absorb it. It comes naturally to them.
Right. Grant has a question. So how are the studies able to determine if the learning losses are caused by dips in mental health versus loss of social connection?
Yeah, that's a really good question also, because I think these could both be at work. Not only were you not in school or you were not able to learn as well over Zoom, but that you were down, you were depressed, you're anxious, particularly for the teenagers. I don't know that we're going to be able to pull them apart. It's possible that we can delve into those data and try to understand dosage effects. Were the kids who were successful more days of online learning? Are they the ones that look as though their learning is boosted? when compared to those who had less dosage. That would tell you something about the school factor. And then other studies would measure, kids are pretty honest about telling you when they're anxious and when they're feeling down. They don't call it depression. They say they're down. And you could try to correlate kids' measures of their own feelings against their learning scores to try to parcel out what part of this is your mental health and what part of this is your academic learning. Because I think they're both playing a role. It's hard to learn. It's hard to learn when we understand what learning is when you are anxious and or depressed.
Right, right. And I've heard so many people say that the next quote unquote pandemic is actually a mental health crisis.
I think that that is something to pay attention to. Let's put it that way. Yeah. We need to pay attention to people's at all ages mental health, and our mental health has just been on a hard ride, a very difficult period, and starved. Our social brains kind of starved of the kind of interaction that helps us moderate feelings of depression. When you get down, what do you tend to do? You call a friend, you call a relative, you get together with someone. It alleviates, you see a therapist even, and even that kind of service has gone completely to telehealth. So yeah, I think we are going to have to understand, try to unpack what we've been through. And part of that will be, what have I missed? But also how have my feelings, what do I feel like? How am I feeling? What have I been through? And what should I feel good about?
Right. Tasneem has a question that I quite love because I grew up watching Sesame Street. The question is, do children learn from TV learning shows like nature programs and Sesame Street? I mean, how effective do you think they are?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I think that our studies on the 9-monthers, really young kids, were not learning from video in that first experiment. We've run another experiment since then using video and letting kids touch the screen to activate attention. The screen would activate when they touched it. That made a small change. What made a huge change was letting them watch the screen with another baby. So the social presence of another baby they didn't teach each other how to touch the screen. That wasn't what it was all about. Just the mere presence of another baby boosted the neural signatures of learning. And then when we went back to the live data, the data from our live experiment, and looked at babies who were in sessions alone, because sometimes the other baby doesn't show up, and so they're learning alone in the live setting as opposed to with another baby. When you compare, the babies learned the most when they had the most number of minutes learning with another baby. So the mere presence of social partners boosts a neural component of learning in a way we don't totally understand. But in the TV study, we could show that the neural signatures of learning increased systematically as babies played or learned with a novel baby. So it's something about social novelty. Potentially, way back in evolution, it was important to know who was coming into the group. When someone new came into your group, you had to pay attention. And so I think deeply embedded in our brains is the knowledge of who we're in front of. Do we know them or not? And we pay attention. And it turns out that the little 9-month-old babies have the same brains. And the more they are learning with one another, even novel partners, boosts the neural signatures of learning. It never ceases to amaze me. Science uncovers surprise. This to me was a big surprise. This was a big surprise. I thought the kids who learned together time after time after time would become friends and they'd teach each other how to press the screen. No, it was the novelty that increased the brain's signatures of learning. So
wow.
Pay attention. Science will teach us something new every day.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That's amazing. Wow.
Thank you, Wendy. It was fun. Really fun talking about this.
Well, and Pat will teach us something new every day. I never tire of listening to you. And Wendy, you are the consummate conversationalist, which is why we keep coming back to you. So thank you both very much. This was I think Rick was texting me at one point saying, I feel like Pat is talking directly to me. And I suspect,
Thank
I
you.
suspect that audience members were feeling the same way. This is it's a certainly a scientific conversation, but a deeply personal conversation as well. And so we thank you both for this. And so I'm glad that I got to be back and be part of this event. So it was good for all of us. And Rick.
Sorry. I want to remind everybody that our event next week is on Tuesday, not Wednesday. It's going to be talk around the Alfred P. Sloan award-winning film from Sundance Film Festival, which basically gives an award for great depictions of science or scientists. And the movie's called After Yang. It stars Colin Farrell. Some of you have already RSVP'd for that event. We're going to have John Nine from Sundance Film Festival moderating, Kogonada, the director, and B. Cavella, a futurist who's just got amazing and interesting things to say. She's from the Aspen Institute. So I want to thank everybody for joining this week, and we hope to see you next week as well.
Exactly. Bye-bye.